Her paddles churned the water, but it was as if she had been trying to tow a rock. She couldn't get an inch out of that ship. Again the pilot blew his whistle and waved his arm to port. We could see the tug's paddles turning faster and faster away, broad on our bow. For a moment, tug and ship hung motionless in a crowd of moving shipping, and then the terrific strain that evil, stony-hearted brute would always put on everything tore the towing chock clean out. The tow rope surged over, snapping the iron stanchions of the headrail one after another, as if they had been sticks of sealing wax. It was only then I noticed that in order to have a better view over our heads, Maggie had stepped upon the port anchor as it lay flat on the forecastle deck. It had been lowered properly into its hardwood beds, but there had been no time to take a turn with it. Anyway, it was quite secure as it was for going into dock, but I could see directly that the tow rope would sweep under the fluke in another second. My heart flew right up into my throat, but not before I had time to yell out, "Jump clear of that anchor!" But I hadn't time to shriek out her name. I don't suppose she heard me at all. The first touch of the hawser against the fluke threw her down. She was up on her feet again, quick as lightning, but she was up on the wrong side. I heard a horrid scraping sound. And then that anchor, tipping over, rose up like something alive. Its great rough iron arm caught Maggie round the waist, seemed to clasp her close with a dreadful hug, and flung itself with her over and down into a terrific clang of iron, followed by heavy ringing blows that shook the ship from stem to stern, because the ring stopper held. "How horrible!" I exclaimed. "I used to dream for years afterwards of anchors catching hold of girls," said the man in tweeds a little wildly. He shuddered. With the most pitiful howl, Charlie was over after her almost on the instant. But, Lord, he didn't see as much as a gleam of her red tam-o'-shanter in the water. Nothing whatever. In a moment there were half a dozen boats around us, and he got pulled into one. I, with the boatswain and the carpenter, let go the other anchor in a hurry and brought the ship up somehow. The pilot had gone silly. He walked up and down the forecastle head, wringing his hands and muttering to himself, "Killing women now! Killing women now!" Not another word could you get out of him. Dusk fell, then a night black as pitch. "Ship ahoy!" Two Gravesend watermen came alongside. They had a lantern in their wherry, and looked up the ship's side, holding onto the ladder without a word. I saw in the patch of light a lot of loose, fair hair down there. He shuddered again. After the tide turned, poor Maggie's body had floated clear of one of them big mooring buoys, he explained. I crept aft, feeling half dead, and managed to send a rocket up to let the other searchers know on the river. And then I slunk away forward like a cur, and spent the night sitting on the heel of the bowsprit so as to be as far as possible out of Charlie's way. "Poor fellow," I murmured. "Yes, poor fellow," he repeated musingly. That brute wouldn't let him, not even him, cheat her of her prey. But he made her fast in dock next morning. He did. We hadn't exchanged a word, not a single look for that matter. I didn't want to look at him. When the last rope was fast, he put his hands to his head and stood gazing down at his feet as if trying to remember something. The men waited on the main deck for the words that end the voyage. Perhaps that is what he was trying to remember. I spoke for him. "That'll do, men." I never saw a crew leave a ship so quietly. They sneaked over the rail one after another, taking care not to bang their sea chests too heavily. They looked our way, but not one had the stomach to come up and offer to shake hands with the mate, as is usual. I followed him all over the empty ship, to and fro, here and there, with no living soul about but the two of us, because the old ship-keeper had locked himself up in the galley, both doors. Suddenly poor Charlie mutters in a crazy voice, "I'm done here," and strides down the gangway, with me at his heels, up the dock, out at the gate, on towards Tower Hill. He used to take rooms with a decent old landlady in America Square to be near his work. All at once he stops short, turns round, and comes back straight at me. "Ned," says he, "I'm going home." I had the good luck to sight a four-wheeler, and got him in just in time. His legs were beginning to give way. In our hall he fell down on a chair, and I'll never forget father's and mother's amazed, perfectly still faces as they stood over him. They couldn't understand what had happened to him till I blubbered out, "Maggie got drowned yesterday in the river." Mother let out a little cry. Father looks from him to me and from me to him, as if comparing our faces. For upon my soul, Charlie did not resemble himself at all. Nobody moved, and the poor fellow raises his big brown hands slowly to his throat, and with one single tug rips everything open, collar, shirt, waistcoat, a perfect wreck and ruin of a man. Father and I got him upstairs somehow, and Mother pretty nearly killed herself nursing him through a brain fever. The man in tweeds nodded at me significantly. There was nothing that could be done with that brute. She had a devil in her. "Where's your brother?" I asked, expecting to hear he was dead. But he was commanding a smart steamer on the China coast, and never came home now. Jerriman fetched a heavy sigh, and the handkerchief being now sufficiently dry, put it up tenderly to his red and lamentable nose. "She was a ravening beast," the man in tweeds started again. "Old Colchester put his foot down and resigned. And would you believe it, Apps and Sons wrote to ask whether he wouldn't reconsider his decision. Anything to save the good name of the Apps family. Old Colchester went to the office then and said that he would take charge again, but only to sail her out into the North Sea and scuttle her there. He was nearly off his chump. He used to be darkish iron grey, but his hair went snow white in a fortnight. And Mr. Lucian Apps, they had known each other as young men, pretended not to notice it. Here's infatuation, if you like. Here's pride for you. They jumped at the first man they could get to take her, for fear of the scandal of the Apps family not being able to find a skipper. He was a festive soul, I believe, but he stuck to her grim and hard. Wilmot was his second mate, a harum-scarum fellow, and pretending to a great scorn for all the girls. In fact, he was really timid, but let only one of them do as much as lift her little finger in encouragement, and there was nothing that could hold the beggar. As apprentice once, he deserted abroad after a petticoat, and would have gone to the dogs then if his skipper hadn't taken the trouble to find him and lug him by the ears out of some house of perdition or other. It was said that one of the firm had been heard once to express a hope that this brute of a ship would get lost soon, I can hardly credit the tale unless it might have been Mr. Alfred Apps, whom the family didn't think much of. They had him in the office, but he was considered a bad egg altogether, always flying off to race meetings and coming home drunk. You would have thought that a ship so full of deadly tricks would run herself ashore some day, out of sheer cussedness. But not she. She was going to last forever. She had a nose to keep off the bottom. Jerriman made a grunt of approval. A ship after a pilot's own heart, eh? Jeered the man in tweeds. Well, Wilmot managed it. He was the man for it, but even he, perhaps, couldn't have done the trick without the green-eyed governess or nurse or whatever she was to the children of Mr. and Mrs. Pamphilius. Those people were passengers in her from Port Adelaide to the Cape. Well, the ship went out and anchored outside for the day. The skipper, hospitable soul, had a lot of guests from town to a farewell lunch, as usual with him. It was 5 in the evening before the last shore boat left the side, and the weather looked ugly and dark in the Gulf. There was no reason for him to get under way. However, as he had told everybody he was going that day, he imagined it was proper to do so anyhow. But as he had no mind, after all these festivities, to tackle the straits in the dark with a scant wind, he gave orders to keep the ship under lower topsails and foresail as close as she would lie, dodging along the land till the morning. Then he sought his virtuous couch. The mate was on deck, having his face washed very clean with hard rain squalls. Wilmot relieved him at midnight. The Apps family had, as you observed, a house on her poop.
A big, ugly, white thing sticking up, Jerriman murmured sadly at the fire.
That's it. A companion for the cabin stairs and a sort of chart-room combined. The rain drove in gusts on the sleepy Wilmot. The ship was then surging slowly to the southward, close-hauled, with the coast within 3 miles or so to windward. There was nothing to look out for in that part of the Gulf, and Wilmot went round to dodge the squalls under the lee of that chart-room, whose door on that side was open. The night was black, like a barrel of coal tar. And then he heard a woman's voice whispering to him. That confounded green-eyed girl of the Pamphilius people had put the kids to bed a long time ago, of course. But it seems she couldn't get to sleep herself. She heard 8 bells struck, and the chief mate come below to turn in. She waited a bit, then got into her dressing-gown and stole across the empty saloon and up the stairs into the chart-room. She sat down on the settee near the open door to cool herself, I dare say. I suppose, when she whispered to Wilmot, it was as if somebody had struck a match in the fellow's brain. I don't know how it was that they had got so very thick. I fancy he had met her ashore a few times before. I couldn't make it out because when telling the story, Wilmot would break off to swear something awful at every second word. We had met on the quay in Sydney, and he had an apron of sacking up to his chin, a big whip in his hand, a wagon driver, glad to do anything not to starve. That's what he had come down to. However, there he was, with his head inside the door, on the girl's shoulder, as likely as not, officer of the watch. The helmsman, on giving his evidence afterwards, said that he shouted several times that the binnacle lamp had gone out. It didn't matter to him because his orders were to sail her close. I thought it funny, he said, that the ship should keep on falling off in squalls, but I luffed her up every time as close as I was able. It was so dark I couldn't see my hand before my face, and the rain came in bucketfuls on my head. The truth was that at every squall The wind hauled aft a little, till gradually the ship came to be heading straight for the coast, without a single soul in her being aware of it. Wilmot himself confessed that he had not been near the standard compass for an hour. He might well have confessed. The first thing he knew was the man on the lookout shouting "Blue murder" forward there. He tore his neck free, he says, and yelled back at him, "What do you say?" "I think I hear breakers ahead, sir," howled the man, and came rushing aft with the rest of the watch in the awfulest blinding deluge that ever fell from the sky, Wilmot says. For a second or so he was so scared and bewildered that he could not remember on which side of the gulf the ship was. He wasn't a good officer, but he was a seaman all the same. He pulled himself together in a second, and the right orders sprang to his lips without thinking. They were to hard up with the helm and shiver the main and mizzen topsails. It seems that the sails actually fluttered. He couldn't see them, but he heard them rattling and banging above his head. No use. She was too slow in going off, he went on, his dirty face twitching and the damned carter's whip shaking in his hand. She seemed to stick fast. And then the flutter of the canvas above his head ceased. At this critical moment the wind hauled aft again with a gust, filling the sails and sending the ship with a great way upon the rocks on her lee bow. She had overreached herself in her last little game. Her time had come. The hour, the man, the black night, the treacherous gust of wind, the right woman to put an end to her. The brute deserved nothing better. Strange are the instruments of Providence. There's a sort of poetical justice. The man in tweeds looked hard at me. The first ledge she went over stripped the false keel off her. Rip! The skipper, rushing out of his berth, found a crazy woman in a red flannel dressing gown flying round and round the cuddy, screeching like a cockatoo. The next bump knocked her clean under the cabin table. It also started the sternpost and carried away the rudder, and then that brute ran up a shelving, rocky shore, tearing her bottom out, till she stopped short, and the foremast dropped over the bows like a gangway. "Anybody lost?" I asked. "No one, unless that fellow Wilmot," answered the gentleman unknown to Miss Blank, looking round for his cap. "And his case was worse than drowning for a man. Everybody got ashore all right. Gale didn't come on till next day, dead from the west, and broke up that brute in a surprisingly short time. It was as though she had been rotten at heart." He changed his tone. "Rain left off? I must get my bike and rush home to dinner. I live in Herne Bay. Came out for a spin this morning." He nodded at me in a friendly way and went off with a swagger.
"Do you know who he is, Jerriman?" I asked.
The North Sea pilot shook his head dismally. "Fancy losing a ship in that silly fashion. Oh dear, oh dear," he groaned in lugubrious tones, spreading his damp handkerchief again like a curtain before the glowing grate. On going out I exchanged a glance and a smile, strictly proper, with the respectable Miss Blank, barmaid of the Three Crows.
This concludes the reading of The Brute by Joseph Conrad. And now we begin Suspense, an unfinished Napoleonic novel by Joseph Conrad. This unfinished book consists of 4 parts and is 274 pages long. The following material appears on the dust jacket of the book. Like Dickens' The Mystery of Edwin Drood, Schubert's Symphony in B minor, or the Venus de Milo, This unfinished work, Conrad's last, is all the more fascinating because of the attention it draws to what is left, illuminating the clarity and force of narrative, the elevated prose, and downright great yarn-spinning of one of the great novelists of all time. Set in the time of Napoleon's Elban exile, Suspense is a spy novel, a novel of manners, and a coastal sea adventure, such as only the masterful Conrad could concoct.
Part 1. Chapter 1. A deep red glow flushed the fronts of marble palaces piled up on the slope of an arid mountain whose barren ridge traced high on the darkening sky a ghostly and glimmering outline. The winter sun was setting over the Gulf of Genoa. Behind the massive shore, the sky to the east was like darkening glass. The open water, too, had a glassy look, with a purple sheen, in which the evening light lingered as if clinging to the water. The sails of a few becalmed feluccas looked rosy and cheerful, motionless in the gathering gloom. Their heads were all pointing towards the superb city. Within the long jetty, with the squat round tower at the end, the water of the harbor had turned black. A bigger vessel, with square sails issuing from it and arrested by the sudden descent of the calm, faced the red disk of the sun. Her ensign hung down, and its colors were not to be made out. But a lank man in a shabby sailor's jacket, and wearing a strange cap with a tassel, who lounged with both his arms thrown over the black breech of an enormous piece of ordnance, that with 3 of its monstrous fellows squatted on the platform of the tower, seemed to have no doubt of her nationality. For to the question of a young civilian in a long coat and Hessian boots, and with an ingenious young countenance above the folds of a white neckcloth, he answered curtly, taking a short pipe out of his mouth, but not turning his head, "She's Elban." He replaced his pipe, and preserved an unsociable air. The elegant young man with the pleasant countenance, who was Cosmo, the son of Sir Charles Latham of Latham Hall, Yorkshire, repeated under his breath, "Elban," and remained wrapped up in still contemplation of the becalmed ship with her undistinguishable flag. It was not till the sun had sunk beneath the waters of the Mediterranean, and the undistinguishable flag had been hauled down on board the motionless ship, that he stirred and turned his eyes towards the harbor. The nearest prominent object in it was the imposing shape of an English line of battle ship, moored on the west side not far from the quay. Her tall spars overtopped the roofs of the houses, and the English ensign at her flagstaff had been just hauled down and replaced by a lantern that looked strange in the clear twilight. The forms of shipping, crowded towards the head of the harbor, were merging into one another. Cosmo let his eyes wander over the circular platform of the tower. The man leaning over the gun went on smoking with indifference. "Are you the guardian of this tower?" asked the young man. The other gave him a sidelong glance and made answer without changing his attitude, and more as if speaking to himself. "This is now an unguarded spot. The wars are over." "Do they close the door at the bottom of this tower at night?" inquired Cosmo. "That is a matter worth consideration, especially for those like you, for instance, who have a soft bed to go to for the night." The young man put his head on one side and looked at his interlocutor with a faint smile. "You don't seem to care," he said, "so I conclude I need not. As long as you are content to stay here, I am safe enough. I followed you up the stairs, you know." The man with the pipe stood up abruptly. "You followed me here?" Why did you do that in the name of all the saints?" The young man laughed as if at a good joke. "Because you were walking in front of me. There was nobody else in view near the mole. Suddenly you disappeared. Then I saw that the door at the bottom of the tower was open, and I walked up the stairs onto this platform, and I would have been very surprised if I hadn't found you here." The man in the strange cap, ornamented with a tassel, had taken his pipe out of his mouth to listen. "That was all?" "Yes, that was all." "Nobody but an Englishman would behave like that," commented the other to himself, a slight appearance of apprehension passing over his features. "You are an eccentric people." "I don't see anything eccentric in what I've done. I simply wanted to walk out of the town. The mole was as good as any other part. It is very pleasant here." A slight breeze touched the two men's faces while they stood silent, looking at each other. "I'm but an idle traveler," said Cosmo easily. "I arrived this morning by land. I am glad I had the idea to come out here to behold your town glowing in the sunset, and to get a sight of a vessel belonging to Elba. There can't be very many of them, but you, my friend—" "I have as much right to idle away my time here as any English traveler," interrupted the man hastily. "It is very pleasant here," repeated the young traveler, staring into the dusk which had invaded the platform of the tower. "Pleasant," repeated the other. "Yes, perhaps. The last time I was on this platform I was only 10 years old. A solid round shot was spinning and rattling all over the stone floor. It made a wondrous disturbance and seemed a living thing, full of fury." "A solid shot!" exclaimed Cosmo, looking all over the smooth flagstones as if expecting to see the traces of that visitation. "Where did it come from?" "It came from an English brig belonging to my Lord Keith's squadron. She stood in quite close and opened fire on us. Heaven only knows why. The audacity of your people! A single shot from one of those big fellows," he continued, slapping the enormous bulging breech of the gun by his side, "would have been enough to sink her like a stone." "I can well believe it." "But the fearlessness of our seamen has ceased to astonish the world long ago," murmured the young traveler. "There are plenty of fearless people in the world, but luck is even better than courage. The brig sailed away unscathed. Yes, luck is even better than courage, surer than wisdom, and stronger than justice. Luck is a great thing. It is the only thing worth having on one's side. And you people have always had it. Yes, signore, you belong to a lucky nation, or else you would not be standing here on this platform looking across the water in the direction of that crumb of land that is the last refuge of your greatest enemy." Cosmo leaned over the stone parapet near the embrasure of the gun, on the other side of which the man with the short pipe in his hand made a vaguely emphatic gesture. "I wonder what thoughts pass through your head," he went on in a quiet, detached tone. "Or perhaps you are too young yet to have many thoughts in your head. Excuse my liberty, but I have always heard that one may be frank in speech with an Englishman, and by your speech there can be no doubt of you being of that nation. I can assure you I have no thoughts of hatred. Look, the Elban ship is getting farther away. Or is it only the darkness that makes her seem so? The night air is heavy. There is more wind on the water than up here where we stand. But I don't think she has moved away. You are interested in that Elban ship, signore? There is a fascination now about everything connected with that island, confessed the ingenuous traveler. You have just said that I was too young to think. You don't seem so very much older than myself. I wonder what thoughts you may have. The thoughts of a common man. Thoughts that could be of no interest to an English milord, answered the other in a grimly deprecatory tone. Do you think that all Englishmen are lords? Asked Cosmo with a laugh. I didn't think. I went by your appearance. I remember hearing an old man once say that you were a lordly nation. Really? Exclaimed the young man, and laughed again in a low, pleasant note. I remember hearing of an old man who called us a nation of traders. Nazione di mercante, repeated the man slowly. Well, that may be true, too. Different men, different wisdoms. This didn't occur to me, said Cosmo, seating himself with a little spring on the stone parapet of the tower. He rested one foot on the massive gun carriage, and fixed his clear eyes on the dark red streak on the western sky, left by the retreating sun like a long gash inflicted on the suffering body of the universe. Different men, different wisdoms, he repeated musingly. I suppose it must be. People's lives are so very different. And of what kind was the wisdom of your old man? The wisdom of a great plain, as level almost as the sea, said the other gravely. His voice was as unexpected when I heard it as your own, signore. The evening shadows had closed about me just after I had seen to the west, on the edge of the world, as it were, a lion miss his spring on a bounding deer. They went away right into the glow and vanished. It was as though I had dreamed. When I turned round, there was the old man behind me, no farther away than half the width of this platform. He only smiled at my startled looks. His long silver locks stirred in the breeze. He had been watching me, it seems, from folds of ground and from amongst reed beds for nearly half a day, wondering what I might be at. I had come ashore to wander on the plain. I like to be alone sometimes. My ship was anchored in a bight of this deserted coast a good many miles away, too many to walk back in the dark for a stranger like me. So I spent the night in that old man's ranch, a hut of grass and reeds near a little piece of water, peopled by a multitude of birds. He treated me as if I had been his son. We talked till dawn, and when the sun rose, I did not go back to my ship. What I had on board of my own was not of much value, and there was certainly no one there to address me as my son in that particular tone. You know what I mean, signore? I don't know, but I think I can guess, was the answer, whose light-hearted yet earnest frankness was particularly boyish, and provoked a smile on the part of the older man. His English interlocutor went on after a pause. You deserted from your ship to join a hermit in a wilderness, simply because the tone of his voice appealed to your heart? Is that your meaning? You have guessed it, signorino. Perhaps there was more in it than that. There is no doubt about it that I did desert from my ship. And where was that? On the coast of South America, answered the man from the other side of the big gun with sudden curtness. And now it is time for us to part. But neither of them stirred, and for some time they remained silent, growing shadowy to each other on the massive tower, which itself, in the advancing night, was but a gray shadow above the dark and motionless sea. How long did you stay with that hermit in the desert? Asked Cosmo. And how did you leave him? Signore, it was he who left me. After I had buried his body, I had nothing more to do there. I had learned much during that year, What is it you learned, my friend? I should like to know. Signore, his wisdom was not like that of other men, and it would be too long to explain to you here on this tower and at this late hour of the day. I learned many things. How to be patient, for instance. Don't you think, Signore, that your friends or the servants at the inn may become uneasy at your long absence? I tell you I haven't been much more than 2 hours in this town, and I have spoken to nobody in it till I came upon you, except, of course, to the people at the inn. They may start looking for you. Why should they trouble their heads? It isn't late yet. Why should they notice my absence? Why? Simply because your supper may be ready by this time, retorted the man impatiently. It may be, but I am not hungry yet, said the young man casually. Let them search for me all over the town if they like. Then, in a tone of interest, do you think they will think of looking for me here? He asked. No, this is the last spot anybody would think of, muttered the other as if to himself. He raised his voice markedly. We must part indeed. Good night, signore. Good night. The man in the seaman's jacket stared for a moment, then with a brusque movement cocked his cap with the strange tassel more on the side of his head. I am not going away from this spot, he said. I thought you were. Why did you wish me good night, then? Because we must part. I suppose we must, some time or other, agreed Cosmo in a friendly voice. I should like to meet you again. We must part at once, this moment, on this tower. Why? Because I want to be left alone, answered the other after the slightest of pauses. Oh, come, why on earth do you want to be left alone? What is it you could do here? Protested the other with great good humor. Then, as if struck by an amusing notion, unless indeed you want to practice incantations, he continued lightly, and perhaps call the evil one to your side. He paused. There are people, you know, that think it can be done, he added in a mocking tone. They are not far wrong, was the other's ominous reply. Each man has a devil not very far from his elbow. Don't argue, signore. Don't call him up in me. You had better say no more and go in peace from here. The young traveler did not change his careless attitude. The man in the cap heard him say quietly, almost in a tone of self-communion, I prefer to stay in peace here. It was indeed a wonderful peace. The sound of their quiet voices did not seem to affect it in the least. It had an enormous and overpowering amplitude, which seemed rather to the man in the cap to take the part of the Englishman's calm obstinacy against his growing anger. He couldn't repress an impulsively threatening movement in the direction of his inconvenient companion, but it died out in perplexity. He pushed his cap still more on one side and simply scratched his head. You are one of those people that are accustomed to have their own way. Well, you can't have your way this time. I have asked you quietly to leave me alone on this tower. I asked you as man to man. But if you won't listen to reason, Cosmo, putting the palms of his hands against the edge of the parapet, sprang lightly nearer to the middle of the platform and landed without a stagger. His voice was perfectly even. Reason is my only guide, he declared, but your request looks like mere caprice. For what can you possibly have to do here? The seabirds are gone to sleep, and I have as much right to the air up here as you. Therefore, a thought seemed to strike him. Surely this can't be your trysting place, he commented in a changed tone, through which pierced a certain sympathy. A short, scornful laugh from the other checked him, and he muttered to himself soberly, No, altogether unfit, amongst those grim old guns. He raised his voice. All I can do is to give you all the room." He backed away from the center of the platform and perched himself this time on the massive breech of a 60-pounder. "Go on with your incantations," he said then to the tall and dim figure, whose immobility appeared helpless for a moment. It broke the short period of silence, saying deliberately, "I suppose you are aware that at any time since we have begun to talk together it was open to me to fling myself upon you unawares as you sat on the parapet, and knock you over to the bottom of this tower?" He waited a moment, then in a deeper tone, "Will you deny it?" he said. "No, I won't deny it," was the careless answer. "I hadn't thought to be on my guard, but I can swim." "Don't you know there is a border of big blocks of stone there? It would have been a terrible death. And now, will the signore do what I ask him and return to his inn, which is a much safer place than this platform?" "Safety is not a great inducement, and I don't believe for a moment you ever thought of attacking me in a treacherous manner." "Well," the tall, shadowy figure crowned by the shape of the strange cap admitted reluctantly, "well, since you put it in those words, signore, I did not. You see, I believe you are a fine fellow. But as it is, I am under no sort of obligation to listen to you." "You are crafty," burst out the other violently. "It's in the blood. How is one to deal with people like you?" "You could try to drive me off," suggested the other. There was no answer for a time. Then the tall figure muttered reflectively to itself, "After all, he's an Englishman." "I don't think myself invincible on that account," observed Cosmo calmly. "I know. I have fought against English soldiers in Buenos Aires. I was only thinking that, to give the devil his due, men of your nation don't consort with spies or love tyranny either. Tell me, is it true that you have only been 2 hours in this town?" "Perfectly true." "And yet all the tyrants of the world are your allies," the shadowy man pursued his train of thought half aloud. The no less shadowy traveler remarked quietly into the gathering night, "You don't know who my friends are?" "I don't. But I think you are not likely to go with a tale to the Austrian spies, or consort with the Piedmontese sbirri. As to the priests who are poking their noses everywhere, I don't know a single soul in Italy," interrupted the other. "But you will soon. People like you make acquaintances everywhere. But it's idle talk with strangers that I fear. Can I trust you as an Englishman not to talk of what you may see?" "You may. I can't imagine what unlawful thing you are about to commit here.